and then Dr. Thompson will do the introductions.
Thank you.
Sure. I want to welcome everyone to Grand Rounds. It's great to have everyone here. We've had great success with wonderful attendance since we've gone to Zoom. So if there's any good things that come out of this pandemic, we get to invite great speakers from distant lands to join us. So welcome everyone. I ask that you put yourself on mute so that we have decreased distractions and we can open up later for questions. So I want to hand it over to Dr. Thompson to make the introductions. Scott?
Thank you very much, Jill. And it would be wrong if we didn't start our day today with a congratulations to Professor and Chair, Dr. Jill Rockbeisel. I'm sure all of you in psychiatry are already aware, but for the rest of us, we've just gotten the announcement today that it's finally official. And, on behalf of all of us, we're delighted and wish you all the best, Jill, and congratulations.
Scott, thanks so much. I'm super excited, particularly to even heighten our, heighten our collaborations with other departments such as yourself. I see Dr. McCarthy's on from pharmacology. So it is just a fabulous day and I'm very excited. Thank you very much.
Great. So it is a great pleasure today to have Dr. Argyris Stringaris with us from the NIH. This is an unusual and the first of what I hope will be an ongoing series of jointly organized and sponsored and attended psychiatry grand rounds together with the basic science neuroscience community here on campus, the program in neuroscience. And so I'm delighted to see as the participant lists go flying by that there are lots of the PIN people also joining us today. And I think this is good news for all of us. And I hope this is an ongoing endeavor that we can keep working towards. So Dr. Stringaris is an MD PhD and a senior investigator at the NIMH, where he is the chief of the Mood, Brain, and Development Unit in the NIMH. And also a professor of clinical psychiatry at Georgetown University. He received his training in child and adolescent psychiatry at Maudsley University Hospital in London and received his PhD from the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College in London. He stayed on in London for several years to complete his postgraduate training at the Maudsley and also at the Institute for Psychiatry. And then we were very lucky somehow to recruit him to the United States, where he's been working at the NIH since then. He's had a tremendous success. He has been awarded the 2014 Klingenstein Foundation Prize by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the 2010 Research Prize from the European Psychiatric Association, the National Institute of Mental Health Outstanding Mentor Award. He is a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and in 2019, he received the Gerald Clerman Young Investigator Award from the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. So a lot of exemplary achievements there in this early in his career. He is also the president-elect of the International Society for Research in Child and Adolescent Psychopathology. So Dr. Stringaris has done a lot of really provocative work looking at how mood is generated and maintained, and also, of course, how it contributes to the pathology of psychiatric diseases. He published a very provocative review article, actually, well, it came out a while ago, but 2021, I believe, in Biological Psychiatry, really sort of asking some questions that resonated with me and my group about what reward deficits can tell us about the pathology of depression and the treatment of depression. And really looking forward to his talk today, entitled "What is Mood and What to Do About It? A Computational Psychiatry Perspective." Again, if you, I remind everybody again, please mute yourself during the presentation. Thank you.
Well, can you hear me? Can everyone hear? Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes, great.
Thank you. It's a great honor for me to have been asked to present. There are many people in the audience who I very much admire and have learned from over the years. And it was a very generous introduction, and I'm afraid that your expectations have been built up unduly. So I hope I can live up to at least a fraction of that. In fact, I'm like everybody else, I guess, who is in a similar situation. We're going through a pandemic, and this has been quite an interesting time in terms of managing a number of roles in both our families, personal and professional. So it is very unusual. It's very unusual for me to be giving all of my talks online. So if something is unclear or I don't make sense, do feel free to interrupt me. I'm not sure I will have the answer, but I will try to at least. So my question is, what is mood and what to do about it? And as you said, as you heard, a computational psychiatry perspective. And I had some conversations with you, Dr. Thompson, over email about some of these questions, and they have been on my mind from the time of my training, and I've had the opportunity to start now trying to address them a bit more heads-on. So here's an outline of my talk. So I'll start with something very simple, which is what is computational psychiatry. Then I'm going to talk about a great expectation, which is the role of reward processing aberrations in depression. So I think the expectation is great. Something big will come out of it, which will help us transform our understanding of depression and treatment. But great expectations typically come with great challenges as well. And I'm going to be talking a fair bit about them. And then I will return to what I consider to be a pretty fundamental question, which is what is mood, which will occupy a fair chunk of my talk. So what is computational psychiatry? And in a simple way, one could say it's the mathematically precise expression of ideas and hypotheses. Obviously, it can be theory-driven or atheoretical, and it can be applied at all levels, from molecules to trials. So I've actually been writing something about this in the last few days, and realized that first of all, computational neuroscience has obviously been around since forever. Hodgkin and Huxley, were computational, obviously, when they developed the nonlinear differential equations for the action potential. So it's not something new. And every time someone does a t-test, a humble t-test, they're applying a very computational method that has a lot of mathematical background to it, even if when we do it, we don't necessarily do it very consciously about all the assumptions and all the baggage that comes with it. So it's not something entirely new, is what I mean to say by that. And essentially, what the way I see it is, both clinicians and researchers are interested in essentially the same thing, which is establishing relationships between variables, between entities of interest, in a very kind of Ernst Cassirer sort of way. We want to understand the functional relationships between variables. If you're a clinician, you want to know whether an observation you make, a symptom that you observe in a patient, will have some sort of significance about where they will be in the future. You're looking for that sort of relationship expressed in clinical terms, but in research terms, you would say, okay, so what is a predictive value, or something like that. So we're interested in similar things, and the better we're able to formulate these things, the clearer, the more precise, and the more formal, the better. And there are many great people who have, like Tal Yarkoni and others, who have kind of pointed out that there's a big gap between what we say in the introductions of papers and the discussions of papers and what we actually do. So part of what we want to achieve is kind of become more precise and bridge this gap. So I'm kind of on my way. I'm attempting to do this. So that's what is computational about this sort of work. And when I talk to kind of a general audience, I say, well, look, this is a mood. These are mood observations that change over time. In fact, this should be the mood axis. Sorry, I just realized this. And this should be the time axis. So these are kind of mood measurements. We ask people about their mood over a period of time. Let's say that this is now a minute, right? And we ask them every time, okay, how's your mood now? How's your mood now? And we do something to them, some sort of mood induction that I'll talk about later on. And the mood dips and then it goes back up again. And we observe this pattern of reactions. And in a way, the simplest thing to think about, something that most people have done at high school, is think that, well, you have an actual mood in that particular person, and then you're trying to fit a curve to that mood. So you're trying to predict it, as it were. And that's where it becomes kind of both tricky and interesting, is how do you predict? How best do you predict? What's the sort of stuff you do so that you can generalize your predictions and all that? But essentially, when I'm talking about a computational psychiatry today, I'm talking about this sort of stuff. So what is the great expectation? The great expectation is reward processing aberrations in depression. So I probably don't need to remind to the illustrious audience here that depression is potentially lethal. It has its origins in early life, and that is very important, both in terms of the prevalence that it has, but also the rise in incidence that I'll show in a second. It is a global problem and leading cause of years lived in disability, according to the WHO. And for me, as a child psychiatrist, it is the leading cause, as I'll show in a second. I said this before. These are some graphs where you can, this curve here is depicting the cumulative incidence plotted against age in years. I'm sorry about the bad copy. And what you can see here is the incidence curve, the cumulative incidence curve, is very steep for unipolar depression in adolescence and early adulthood, and then it's flattening. Of course, it's fairly flat before that. So it's a developmental problem in many ways. There's other psychiatric disorders, of course. It's not necessarily unique to depression. And in terms of disability-adjusted life years loss, the dailies, unipolar depression tops the list for adolescents. So this is the top 10 causes of dailies lost amongst adolescents, broken down by sex. Male versus female. Female is red, and this graph, and you can see unipolar depressive disorders rank the highest, above pretty much everything else, right? So I talked about the potential lethality. This is just suicides between 1999 and 2014, and there's a rise. There may be some flattening more recently, but depression is one of the main risk factors for it. And sadly, in terms of our ability to treat depression, we're not doing terribly well. I mean, there are some repurposed and new compounds like ketamine, with seminal work coming out of this institution, of course, but in general, we're not doing terribly well. And in my field, in child and adolescent psychiatry, it looks a bit dire. So you have a fair number of people, about maybe 2/3 of most who respond. There's said a fair number of non-responders, and then of those who respond, there's a big group of people who relapse again, and of those who don't respond, only there's only a small proportion of people who will actually respond to a second wave of treatment. So it's not looking that rosy in terms of our treatment of depression. That has several reasons. So when I was thinking, what am I going to do? I want to study depression for a variety of reasons. I've been interested in mood and depression for a number of years. And when one starts their career, they're confronted with this very difficult situation, because what we've been taught is that depression is, of course, a multifactorial illness. And if you think about it, you have genes. Right, I'm just going to break down the potential etiology of depression for a second, although I know it's familiar to most of you. But there's a genetic component, right? Let's say about 30 to 40% of the variance in the phenotypic variance of depression is explained by genetic factors, according to twin studies. That leaves a big chunk for other things that are happening. So there's pure environment. Pure environment is kind of what people often capture as independent life events. It's hard. It's not as easy as one might think to find pure environmental events, the things that have nothing to do with you, and are pure kind of like, it's like, things like an earthquake or a pandemic can be that sort of thing. But there's a lot of other things like complicated things like active gene-environment correlation. So there are aspects of your personality, your genetic makeup, in fact, that can make you elicit a particular environment, a depressogenic environment. And there's, of course, this double whammy of passive gene-environment correlation, where there is a genetic makeup that you inherit from your parents, but if, say, both your parents are depressed as well, then you grow up in a depressogenic environment. In the same way, you grow up in a fantastic environment, of course, if you have a musical talent and your parents, who are musicians as well, play Bach to you all day. So it can work either way, I guess, but it makes things more complicated. And of course, then there is the much contested, but probably real, phenomenon of gene-environment interaction, even if it's not the interactions we necessarily thought a few years ago. But it's the fact that the genetic makeup of some people make them either more vulnerable or more resilient to certain environmental effects. So when one is confronted with this, they say, "Oh gosh, where should I start? What do I do?" And of course, people can go to genetics, people can look at social environments, which are very important. And kind of the thing that I chose to do, one of the things we chose to do, was to think, okay, well, what could be a downstream modifiable pathophysiological mechanism? Before going to psychiatry, I was doing neurology and medicine, and the kind of the very compelling model, of course, is something like, I don't know, diabetes, where okay, there could be various kind of etiological pathways leading to it, but there's a common pathophysiological mechanism, at least to some of its forms, right? Something to do with resistance of insulin in the target tissue, or with the production of insulin. So there's a common downstream and modifiable pathophysiological mechanism. So I was wondering, what is the downstream modifiable pathophysiological mechanism in depression? And I think that's the million-dollar question, because the thing is that etiological questions, much as Aristotle was fond of them, they don't necessarily provide you the answer. So knowing the genetic constellation of something doesn't necessarily mean that you can intervene, whereas knowing the downstream effects of a gene can be very helpful. I'm not arguing against genes right now. I'm just saying that for the purposes of intervention, the pathophysiological mechanisms at the end may be even more important or more amenable to modification. So that's where the great expectation came from. And I was reading at the time a lot of basic literature, and read about this great man called Ribot, who coined the term anhedonia, which is a neologism. It's composed of Greek words, the privative a and hedonia, but it's a neologism by this French neurologist, stroke neuropsychiatrist. And I was fascinated by the fact that you could talk about reward expectations, and you could just map them conceptually onto the phenomenon of anticipatory anhedonia, which anyone who has either worked with patients or known a patient may have come across it, right? It's like, "Johnny, how about we go to the cinema tonight?" And, "No, I really don't want to." But you used to like the cinema. "No, I don't really want to. It doesn't appeal to me." Or reward receipt and outcome, which is what people in basic science were talking about. Be it a sugar kind of pill, sucrose reward, or whatever. And then consummatory anhedonia. It seemed very appealing. Consummatory anhedonia being the fact that you are at the cinema and you still don't like it, or you say you don't like it. So another clinical phenomenon. I thought, wow, this is an amazing mapping of two constructs. And then, of course, there's all the stuff about reward learning and how things can get reinforced, which is at the core of a lot of the interventions in depression research, such as behavioral activation. We say, well, you don't have enough positive reinforcement. Let's build that up, and there's avoidance. So it all seemed to make great sense when I was starting off. And not only that, but it even went further. There was a neural circuit that there is a neural circuit that's great, and this is a picture from the famous Fmri paper from 2016 in Science, and there's a circuit. It involves the VTA, the striatum, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. There's a dopamine story, at least for the anticipation. And, it just kind of all falls together. And you think, gosh, look, you can look at it in animals. You can map those concepts from the animals onto humans. It's very promising, isn't it? So the expectation got built up, and we did some work in this field. And I'm just going to present here some of the summary results and talk just briefly about the individual studies. But one way to figure out, obviously, what's going on in the field and is to do a meta-analysis, the systematic review and meta-analysis. So we did one that included some of our very own studies here, and what we found was that if you look at studies that used either Fmri or EEG and had some sort of reward task in them, you found that for reward consummation, receipt of reward, and reward anticipation, reward expectation, to an extent, there was a signal that differentiated depressed versus non-depressed. Okay, and the signal was, at the sort of right spot. Head of the caudate putamen, sort of thing, and it was a diminished neural activity during reward receipt or reward anticipation in that area of the brain that seemed to be kind of a finding. You see here the kind of pooled value of activations, and as a striatal cluster size, which is basically the number of voxels that differentiate depressed versus non-depressed. So lower signal in that area of the brain compared to people who are healthy volunteers. So depressed have a lower signal during reward anticipation or reward receipt. There's two different graphs for this. The stronger findings was for the reward receipt. And this may have been even stronger. I'm just saying this, although the interaction was not significant. It may be stronger in people who are younger than 18. So there was some meta-analytic evidence, and we found similar evidence with EEG. So there was there's this feedback-related negativity, kind of a deflection at about between 200 and 400 milliseconds, and that is indicative of reward processing. And it showed a similar signal. That it sort of showed a diminished signal in people with depression compared to healthy volunteers. So that was very encouraging, and I just thought, okay, well, let's try to think carefully about whether what we observe is causally related to depression, and that of course is a difficult question. So I kind of started thinking about the Bradford Hill criteria for causality, and some of the basic criteria there are having a longitudinal relationship, showing that what you think is the exposure comes before the outcome, right? I think that's a kind of a necessary condition, at least in our universe, in our kind of linearly thought of universe, where time travels in one direction. Then that it's specific. This is a weaker criterion, and you would want to be able to modify it somehow, which is a tough thing, of course, to do in the living human. In terms of longitudinal relations, we want to see whether reward aberrations precede depression. And as I'll show you, I think they do. And there is some specificity as well. The modifiability has to come more from animal studies, I think, and maybe from some treatment studies, although the results are not entirely straightforward. So in terms of the longitudinal findings, we use something called the monitoring incentive delay task, and those are the sorts of tasks that people used in the meta-analysis that I showed. So basically, you show someone a cue about which you've told that person, look, when you see the circle, you're going to win $5, and when you see the triangle, you're going to either not win, or in some cases, depending on the task, you may lose money. So you show them the cue. There's a fixation period. sorry, you show them the cue, and then you have the kind of response, and then the feedback. So this is obviously an anticipation period, and there's a feedback, a reward receipt period. So you can differentiate these two, and you know, this is this monetary incentive delay task, as it's called, is a kind of a workhorse being used in the ABCD, and we've used it in our lab. So this is a sample. As I said, remember, we want to look at the longitudinal findings here. So this is from the so-called Imogen sample, European multi-center study that participated, and at the time it involved about 1,500 adolescents. The mean age at baseline was 14 years. Did, you know, psychiatric interview and all sorts of things, plus Fmri using this task, the monetary incentive delay task. And we looked at reward anticipation at the time, and what we found was that there was a reduced striatal signal during the reward anticipation. It was related to new onset depression 2 years later, and also to anhedonia rather than low mood. So when I say anhedonia specifically, it was anhedonia rather than low mood. So you can see here this striatal activity at baseline on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, there's three categories: the people who remained healthy within those 2 years, those who've had a new onset subthreshold depression, and those who had a new onset kind of clinical depression, as we called it, or kind of depression that fulfilled all the criteria. And what you can see is that the signal in the striatum was lower at baseline in those with new onset clinical depression, slightly higher in those with new onset subthreshold depression, and those who remained healthy. It was, you know, that's kind of our baseline here. So there was kind of evidence to support this, and there have been a couple of other longitudinal studies before and since supporting this finding, notably out of Pittsburgh and Erica Forbes' group. Now let's go to specificity, which is another thing. So according to theory, if one were to go back to Ribot, then reward aberrations should be specific for anhedonia. So we looked at the ABCD sample at the first release, actually, and we looked at children of 9 to 10 years then, and we looked at the Fmri using the monetary incentive delay task during reward anticipation again, and we found reduced signal in the striatum putamen during reward anticipation, and we found it to be related to the symptom of anhedonia, which we were able to ascertain using just one question. So I point this out here because it's an important measurement issue. Contrasted it to low mood, to anxiety, and to ADHD. And the striatal activity was diminished only for anhedonia, not for low mood, not for anxiety, and not for ADHD. And this kind of region that we found was the only subcortical region with base factor that was above 3. So kind of this is another piece of evidence suggesting that the two may be causally, and I emphasize this. This is another piece of evidence that suggests that there may be a causal relationship. So just to be very clear. So, well, all this kind of build up great expectations. I'm just giving you a bit of a kind of a snapshot. There's lots of studies. There's lots of kind of thinking about it and all that, as you saw with a meta-analysis. So, what are the great challenges there? Well, the first thing to say is, and again, this is kind of a brief overview of the problems with the actual phenotype, with the depression definition. So typically one reads there's 256 syndromes if you believe the DSM. In fact, we calculated it. We ended up with 9,197 depression types if one were just adhered to the DSM criteria. So that's because of simple combinatorics. So the kind of the multitude in there is very big, as Walt Whitman would have said. I'm large, I contain multitudes. This is certainly true for depression definition. So that's a problem, and of course a lot has been written about the phenotypic definition. This causes difficulties, and the extent to which you can distinguish anhedonia or the anhedonias from other symptoms such as fatigue or psychomotor retardation is a big question and not sufficiently clarified, in my opinion. But there are other issues, and yeah, clinicians. We're a sloppy bunch, right? I mean, well, not sloppy perhaps, but we're like, compared to the basic scientists, we're like the engineers, and if you things together, patch them up, not caring necessarily about definitions or the purity of the construct, just trying to get along with reality. But we're surprised to find when we did another piece of work with my outstanding data scientist in our group and staff scientist, Dr. Nielsen, that there's a lot of heterogeneity, actually, not only in the depression definition, but also in the way we measure reward. So across 29 studies, we found 60 different ways to measure reward when we reviewed these. And now, most studies use a p-value of 0.05, but controlling for the number for these contrasts would have required something much lower. And this is just one of the consequences, right? This could be undisclosed testing going on. And in any case, when I talk about reward and you talk about reward, we may not mean the same thing, which is a bit disconcerting. So we were concerned to find that the problem extended beyond the clinical definition. The other thing is that there are many longitudinal studies of this relationship, and this is an issue because, as we said, the condition for a possibility of a causal relationship is that there is a longitudinal relationship, right? And then of the few longitudinal studies that were available, they were in general of weak effect. So the R is about 0.1, which isn't staggering, right? So that's an issue. We then did some simulations to show that even with a small measurement error, the true correlation is about 0.3 at best. And this could decrease forward to about 0.2 when accounting for noise. This is just a big issue, I guess. It shows us that if there is a relationship, it's relatively small. Given the current studies. So this was of course pretty annoying because it suggested to me that what I had chosen to research is quite complex, which of course is great in many ways. But it also meant that I wasn't on my way in discovering an insulin deficit or anything like it, or an insulin resistance in the target tissues, sort of thing. If there's anything there, it's probably more subtle, and we measure it very imprecisely at the moment. So we're pursuing this, of course, very actively, but in a number of ways. We're doing more longitudinal studies, trying to refine measurement. We've built a consortium, particularly about understanding anhedonia and measuring it better. And I encourage anyone who is interested to write to us to participate in this. It's an open group. It's not some sort of club. So we need to do work on that. But at the same time, I thought, well, since my training days, I wanted to understand the concept of mood, and so this is kind of some of the. I'm going to show you now some of the work we've been doing over the last couple of years, but also some of our current work that's not yet published. So I'm taking the risk of presenting it to this, very important group of people. So it may be foolish of me to do, but I think it speaks to a question that is important, in nosology, i.e. in the study of disorders, we talk a lot about mood disorders, right? This is a mood disorder. This is a mood problem. And you would have thought that someone would have a definition for mood, right? So we all talk about them, but we don't know how to define them. So what is a mood disorder? Like, what exactly are we talking about? So our aim here is to build a computational model of mood and manipulate mood using those computational tools. Now, this is difficult, of course, and research, as Popper said, never starts from the definition, but you define it from left to right. So you just kind of try to figure out the definition as you go along. So we start with some sort of operationalization that I'll talk about in a minute. The problem with mood is, but there's a tyranny of the self-evident. We feel that we kind of know what mood is about, and we talk about it in terms of, in qualitative terms. We say a patient suffering from depression, which is a mood problem. Quantitative, we say, oh, this is high scores in mood problems. So patients rely on the tails of the distribution. That's kind of the geneticist's view that this is a Gaussian distribution. There's a liability threshold model, and above a certain threshold, we can accept that you have depression. Inherent to both is a kind of a cross-sectional here and now approach, and a premature reification, i.e. making depression and mood a thing, without having explained to us what this may be. So I think we should just kind of, for the moment, suspend value judgments of what is normal and what's abnormal and all that, and study the person across time. So look at intra-individual, longitudinal, and developmental change beyond the kind of cross-sectional notion. Okay, you now meet the criteria and you don't. And ask why questions. Why is there mood? And we don't do that often in life and science. We don't say, why is there something? We say, okay, what is this, and how can you do something about it? But sometimes, especially when you are at an earlier, the primitive, dare I say, stage, as we are with mood disorders, it's worth thinking about. Well, why is there mood? Is it even something that is it even a good construct to have? And take a systems approach and think of mood as a kind of regulated system. I'll come back to that in a minute. So, and of course, for all my talk about measurement, what I'm going to say is, well, we just operationalize mood in the simplest way possible, which is to do what I do in clinic, which is say, how do you feel today? Or how happy are you in general? Questions like that, and with responses from either 1 to 10 or 0 to 100, or some sort of scale like that. Now, these are simple. This is a simple way of asking about mood, and it's I think clinically meaningful. So you base a lot of that information. You base a lot of that information on the answer that you get, and also what you observe when you ask a person this question. The other thing is, we found that even if we use such a simple question, it correlates very strongly with longer mood questionnaires. So we thought, okay, well, let's have something very simple, which seems to be doing the job. And having something simple was important for the experiments that we wanted to do. So the mood, thus defined, is actually quite stable. It has a nicety of about 0.8 over 2 weeks, and it has an even higher ICC if you look at it within kind of after a day or so, and certainly within an hour. So it's kind of quite stable, correlates well with other depression. So we use this, and I'm going to talk to you now about a series of findings that we have about mood, which I'm trying to kind of put in some order to be able to draw some initial inferences about mood to do some further modeling. So this finding here concerns the resilience of mood. So what we've done here, we looked at several ways for perturbing mood. We have a paper in bioRxiv, which is under revision in eLive at the moment, talking about this and the computational modeling we did. And we did it a complex way, which is to use a closed loop system that uses reward prediction errors, i.e. manipulates rewards in some sort of way to shift mood around, or we just increased and decreased rewards. And what we managed to do is to have this is a phase of increasing mood, and you can see that we are okay at increasing mood slightly from the baseline, but we're very good at decreasing mood in the second block. This is the number of trials. The whole thing lasts for about half an hour, So this is about 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, or 8 minutes each block. So we decrease mood quite strongly, and then we increase it again. So we have a very good, and very happy to share with anyone who's interested in manipulation for changing people's mood. Certainly bringing it down, that is parameterizable and everything. So that's really great. But one of the interesting observations that we've had with this, and regardless of how we manipulated mood, what we found was that mood tends to return to the individual baseline, even after a perturbation over 30 minutes. And the ICC, the stability of the individual compared to the group, is quite remarkable. It's about 0.7. So people kind of return back when we stop the intervention. They return back to where they were. So mood seems to be kind of resilient in some sort of way. Bring it down, we'll bring it down, we'll bring it down, we'll bring it back up again, but then it kind of stabilizes around where it started. Now, what is the standard evolutionary account we have of emotions and of mood? Let's start with emotions. At any given moment in time, emotions act as alarm signals. This is kind of the big take-home message from some of the famous evolutionary psychology and psychiatry work, that, emotions can act as alarm signals. I think they do all sorts of other things as well that I'm very happy to discuss. I think they're very important, very neglected. But you can see how there's a negative event, negative emotion, avoidance behavior, or the two come together depending on which school or thought you belong to about what an emotion is, a preparedness for action, whether it includes or not the action. So that's kind of a standard account. So mood is thought to integrate over environmental events. So over a period of time, if you have positive and negative events, mood is supposed to kind of somehow keep track of what's happening. And the idea that mood integrates over longer time scales is comes from evolutionary psychiatry, but there is some evidence from work that Rob Rutledge has done, and some of the theorizing that Ranil Dar and colleagues had done. So there's this kind of integration going on. So, and what we found is, when we kind of ran our experiments in 3 different sorts of environments, kind of using our mood manipulations and just having them play a random game, what we found has been that expectations seem to be extremely important. Expectations about reward seem to be very important. So and by expectation we define rewards and punishers, which is this term here, the sum of reward and punishers over the total of number of events with the head rewards and punishers, i.e. some sort of expectation average. And mood at any given moment in time is dependent on long-term expectations. So a discounted expectation term, the integration of a discounted expectation term. This was kind of one of the biggest findings we've had, and it seems like we integrate over events by building this long-term average expectation, which has some kind of interesting implications, in the sense that it can be shown mathematically that early events, so events that happen early in the course of an experiment, at least of this, in the first minutes, say, of that half hour, carry a bigger weight than events that happen later on. So that there's a kind of a primacy rather than a recency weighting of mood. You will remember from memory psychology that there's kind of primacy, there's recency effects, and there's both seem to be very important in memory, so that a U-shaped model is appropriate. We find that in terms of mood, at least, in the memory of mood, that early events seem to outweigh recent events, and that a primacy model is better than a U-shaped model, where both primacy and recency are important. We also found that this expectation term, when people kind of play this experiment, this game of mood manipulation that I showed you before in the scanner, is associated, and that's what I mean by neural encoding, associated with activity in the ACC. And we then try to triangulate this, if you like, by looking at what happens in MEG, and we found that high beta oscillations in the ACC are indeed associated in MEG as well with the expectation term that I was talking about. And we also found that the relationship between high beta oscillations and mood is mediated via this expectation term. And I'm using the term mediated here carefully because obviously we don't have a model that can we don't have an experimental setup that can demonstrate this mediation here. And people may have read recent concerns that people have raised about using path models to thoughtlessly. So what I'm saying is that there is this relationship between high beta activity expectations and mood, and there's this kind of form of triangulation, which I think is kind of interesting. So there is a kind of indirect effect via the expectation term. So kind of, I talked to you about what happens during a task and kind of, when we try to manipulate people's mood or try to shift it around. But I want to tell you now, and this is kind of out in the public in the preprint, and hopefully will be out soon. But there's another thing that we've been working on a lot recently, which has been what happens in the absence of events. So suppose you have no events. What happens at rest, so to speak? And you'll say, you'll ask me, why are you interested in what's happening in the absence of events or when people are at rest? And the answer is, well, this is not an unusual occurrence in one's daily life to just for something not to be happening and for us to be waiting. And for those of you working in fMRI, they will know about resting state fMRI and the importance of that, where you're asked to basically stare at a cross, like the one you see here, for a period of 6, 8, 10 minutes, nowadays even 22 minutes to increase reliability, for very long periods of time indeed. So what happens in the absence of stimuli? And of course, this has been a question that has been around, that has been in my mind for a while, but I have to be honest and say that it wasn't deliberate that we started doing research on this. We basically asked ourselves, well, we're good at manipulating mood. What happens, we said, if we just stop that mood induction? People should go back to, I showed you before, the stability they have. They go back to where they started from. So I said, okay, well, let's ask them to just rate their mood over a period of minutes, and then we'll have a baseline and see what happens. And then we realized it was a serendipitous finding that people's mood drops over time. So if you ask people to rate their mood, you say, okay, would you mind rating your mood every minute or every 30 seconds or every 2 minutes? They in the absence of stimuli, or just when they just stare at a cross, their mood drops. Which is quite a thing. I thought, oh gosh, okay, well maybe it's very, very annoying to be staring at a cross and be asked to rate your mood. So maybe it's just that. So we did all sorts of things. We did all sorts of things to kind of figure that one out. And we had them rate with very little, very rarely, like, I don't know, 4 times in total during 9 minutes. We had them rate for shorter periods of time, rate for longer periods of time. And no matter what happened, the kind of mood declined at quite a rate. So after about 10 minutes of rest, about close to 20% of the mood scale we were using. And we really tried to get rid of it, and we couldn't. So we oh, sorry. First of all, I should say that, so the labels got switched. So this is a generalizable thing because we showed it to happen in adolescents as well as adults, and in the lab as well as when we did an MTurk. So it wasn't kind of, okay, well, you did ask people to do it when in a particular environment. It seems to be happening at your home computer as much as when you're at the NIH, at least. And the other thing that became particularly kind of worrisome, is that it occurs during tasks. I don't know whether you can see my screen there. It shows me. I should move that down. It occurs with simple tasks. So we gave them visuomotor feedback. We just kind of had them play a random game, a random gamble, and we had this kind of decline in mood still. So we couldn't get rid of it. And then we found also that this passage of time dysphoria is related, which is how we termed it, was related to depression and to reward sensitivity. What you see here is that if you look at this is kind of the linear term of the decline. So we ran a mixed effects model on these mood data and had this kind of linear decline term, so the time term essentially. So this time term, so what happens to mood in the passage of time, was related to people's life happiness ratings, and which are strongly correlated with depression. And you can see that there's a decline. The decline is stronger in those who have higher happiness ratings. Plus, and those people who are more sensitive to the passage of time are also more sensitive to rewards. In other words, those who are less sensitive to rewards are less likely also to show this kind of passage of time dysphoria. And you can see here that there's an interaction, that this relationship between reward sensitivity and passage of time is less pronounced in those with greater depression risk. So this is another thing that we thought, oh gosh, this is a very interesting aspect about mood. So mood at any given point in time must include, and this is what we did with our computational model, and we're doing now, must include some sort of passage of time term. And so this is a purely descriptive term, right? We just see that time does something to mood, just the mere passage of time leads to some mood decline in a particular subset of people, at least, those who have some reward sensitivity, those who are kind of have somehow it correlates with reward sensitivity. So we've asked ourselves, and we're in the process of thinking about experiments about this, what this might be, and of course it may be a future utility, an opportunity cost indication, and it may be that our models of mood must incorporate not just the integration of the past, but also a comparison of the current state with a perceived future state, with what people believe they could be getting out of the future. So this is something we're working on at the moment. It makes mood even more interesting, I think, as a phenomenon. So it's an integration of the past, but also of our beliefs about the future. Now, this was foreshadowed, of course, in the idea of the expectations that we were talking about before, and the resultant prediction errors. But I think it becomes very interesting in light of these findings. Moreover, you should know that when participants receive rest periods, like they're common in Fmri, then they're less likely to engage in a behavior. They're less likely to gamble somehow. It makes them more gambling averse. So this is a kind of the proportion of people gambling, or the proportion of choosing to gamble in the first 4 trials after a rest period. And you can see that when people are not resting, they haven't had a period of rest before. They're more likely to gamble than if they had a short period of rest or a longer period of rest. So which again I think is quite an interesting finding and potentially relevant to methodologists here. So I should say that I'm talking mainly about the implications of these findings for mood, but I think that there are some profound implications for those doing resting state experiments, also people who have rest periods in their experiments, and I don't, certainly with humans we observe this effect, and I should say here, I don't know whether it came through, that we observed this phenomenon in about 15 different cohorts now, and the gambling results that I was showing you, we have data on in 20,000 people, thanks to people in London borrowing their data to us from the Great Brain Experiment. That's Rachel Bedder and Rob Rutledge, to whom we're very grateful to for collaborating with us in this. So it seems to be quite a robust effect, and it makes you think that there could be methodological problems when you are trying to draw inferences about, say, a healthy volunteer versus depressed comparison, and you're these inferences on the basis of resting state scans, because of course the passage of time will have, according to this, some differential effects on these people. I should also add one thing that I haven't shown you here, which is that this resting state dysphoria effect is highly consistent at the group level. So we've literally, as I said, done it in 15 cohorts, and it's been absolutely consistent. However, it is not consistent, it's not as consistent at the individual level, which is particularly worrisome, which means that there is a kind of a state effect. The ICCs, the intra-class correlation coefficients are at about 0.4 to 0.5 at the individual level, which suggests that, which shows that it's not that consistent at the individual level. So you couldn't predict it would be stable and who it would be. So that, I think, creates even bigger methodological challenges, to be honest. So I think that that's something that people would all want to think about when we do resting state imaging. So I'm asking the question of what is mood, and of course it's the ontological is misplaced. It's just a way of speaking here. I don't know whether I'm discovering some sort of deep essence of mood, but what we can say is that it changes with rewards and punishers in the environment, which you would expect, and these changes with the absence of rewards or punishers in the environment during the resting state. It represents expectations of rewards through integration of rewards over time. And I said talked about the integration of rewards from past experience, creating this expectation, and that early rewards or rewards received early during an experiment are more important than recent rewards. And given the time scale of this, it may apply to other kind of interpersonal interactions as well. It made me think about whether when you talk to a patient, the beginning or the end is more important. It seems that the beginning, according to this at least, is quite important. We haven't got the evidence for that for the interpersonal relationships. It's an interesting thing to do, and I have someone in my group who's interested in looking at that. And there's inter-individual variability in the value of rewards and punishers, so how people perceive rewards. And there's, of course, the big issue of mood being something that also takes into account, of course, the perceived value of the future, potentially, so kind of an opportunity cost. Computational account of mood, it has some advantages and some implications. So we integrate over the environmental events. We weigh, this is the early versus late idea that I've talked to you about, in mood changes addressed. So in an experimentally manipulable framework, which allows for further study. And I talked about a little bit about how we manipulate mood, and it's something that gives the opportunity to do much more in this experimental framework. So, as I said, there are some potentially practical implications, such as clinical consultations, the effect of weighting and mood more generally, and perhaps kind of using waiting periods as a training for mood, as a kind of a way of intervening, as it were. It also has some practical implications about things like ecological momentary assessment reports, EMA reports, So it's important to account for timing of mood relative to environmental events, because it may be differential. It may not just be the same with, depending on the time that has passed since an environmental event. So when modeling EMA data, this may be quite relevant too. Now, there are several challenges with this approach as well, which is what are the timescales of integration? Is the model invariant to timescales? Is it the same for minutes, days, weeks, years? Well, I don't know. I presume it won't be, but this is something that we want to test. Now, testing it over years is very hard, but testing it over days and weeks is something potentially more tractable. So we're trying to think of ways of doing this. And as you may imagine, this is tough. The other question is, how are the timescale integrations related to each other? Between those different timescales, and what is the role of memory and context in this integration? So we're borrowing models from memory research. So we're working with Dr. Per Sederberg from the University of Virginia to borrow context models, memory context models, to see how they could help us understand depression and better. How do we in resting state dysphoria, rumination, action seems to have some regulatory role. So it may stop you from thinking about the opportunity cost of things when you're occupied with some sort of activity. This is something that people in behavioral activation seem to be taking into account. Just do something now, and doing may improve your mood. Just that's the primacy of action. But again, these are things that need further experimental experimentation. So the question is, of course, does computational psychiatry have anything to offer for treatment? And again, this is something we're trying to work on. So we have created this mood-machine interface that uses a closed-loop feedback system to manipulate expectations and therefore mood. And which in the next phase to use the insights from the modeling we have to manipulate mood even better. The results so far are good in terms of manipulating mood over those time scales. We're able to, we have effect sizes of up to 3. But we're better at bringing it down than bringing it up, unfortunately. This is kind of something that needs further work, but the insights from the computational modeling, I'm hoping, will help us. And more recently, the MEG results we have give us some clues about timing of events. So we have some evidence of very early processes that are related to our expectation term. And this is something we want to pursue using transcranial magnetic stimulation that is timed on the basis of the MEG results and interleaved with Fmri from the insights we got from the Fmri experiment. So this is one of the things that we're doing in the future. Sorry. So what is computational psychiatry? It is the kind of attempt at formulating questions a bit more precisely than we have been doing. I talked to you about a great expectation, reward processing aberrations in depression. I think there is some converging evidence for this, but there are also very clear limitations to this. So we decided to take a route that drills down to the basics of mood, and we have an ongoing kind of computationally based approach to characterize and modify mood. And with that, I think I will stop here. I've been talking apparently for 59 minutes now, so I will stop now, and I'll thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much. That was very thought-provoking and stimulating. And as somebody who tries to model anhedonia in mice, I thought we were modeling something that was well understood and well defined in humans. And so I'm a little bit taken aback to discover that that's not really the case. Chris and Jill, is there a sort of a strategy here for discussion on Zoom?
So Scott, I believe the idea is we're going to keep the link open so there can be more extensive discussions and questions. I think and so we're just going to keep it open. Usually, depending on how many people stay on, we'll use the chat to field questions, or just have people open their mics and ask questions. So it depends on, I know that there was a plan to have an extended discussion period. So we actually, there is a question in the chat. Scott, do you want to handle the chat? Do you want me to handle the chat?
Me too. I can't tell who the chat is from.
I've got a chat for you if I.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was dreading that Dr. Carpenter would ask me a question. So.
Will, you know what I
don't like. Can I go ahead?
Yes.
The question of whether anhedonia in non-depressed people with schizophrenia is the same as anhedonia in depression, an issue the FDA or all the work across diagnostic boundaries, with which boundaries do you really cross? Do you have a view on that and how that might relate to the mood issues that you get to?
Yes, thank you very much. This is thank you. Now, of course, I would go to you to have those questions answered, because you are the absolute super expert in the field. But from my point of view, I think there is underappreciated heterogeneity in anhedonia. And I'm not a schizophrenia researcher, but I work with people who have schizophrenia and have done even more so in the past. And from what I can see, but I haven't gotten experimental data myself on this, the anhedonia that one sees in what we call anhedonia in schizophrenia, to me, seems to be slightly different and to relate to a more general disorganization of what is salient and to people and what isn't. So prioritization of salient events. But this is impressionistic, I have to say. The thing I want to point out is that when I looked at the studies that were available at least a couple of years ago, when we did the first meta-analysis in 2018, and I looked at the schizophrenia studies that were looking at reward, what I saw was that that depression was either not measured very often, or in one or two studies where it was measured, it accounted for the relationship between schizophrenia and reward processing. So like reward anticipation. So I think back then at least, so I said, this is the last time I looked carefully at the literature was about 2 years ago. I didn't get the impression that the relationship between reward processing and schizophrenia was as clear as I would have liked to. I know that the trend is towards transdiagnostic approaches, and there may be merit in this, and maybe the phenotypic heterogeneity doesn't matter that much. And I may be wrong in saying that schizophrenia, anhedonic schizophrenia is slightly different. But that's my view, as I said, based on those impressions. I can certainly say that it seems to me that there's more than in depression. And if I make a clinical impression, I have people who I call anhedonic in my clinic, right, or on my inpatient unit, and I say this person has anhedonia very clearly, and they have a SHAPS, right? SHAPS is one of the rating scales for anhedonia. That's very high. It's sky high. So I say you have anhedonia, but then that very same person goes and plays a computer game for hours, and if you want to take away that computer game from them, they'll be very annoyed. And there are other things that they really want to do. So they're not anhedonic about that. And we all know that people with anhedonia are also not anhedonic necessarily about their booze or about their drugs, if they're into those things. So the terminology we use is imprecise very often. There are patients, of course, who really have absolutely no interest in anything whatsoever, right? And they are typically very, very depressed people who are nearly catatonic. But otherwise, you always find spots of interest which may even be heightened compared to other things. So there are some kind of phenomena that are unclear to me in terms of anhedonia, and the notion that it's simply, oh, I stopped liking everything to me doesn't seem to be absolutely right. So sorry, this is kind of this is my best attempt at answering your question, Dr. Carpenter. I'm sorry.
Okay, I've got a follow-up here to that one, or a related question from Jim Waltz, which asks about the dynamic nature of mood and maybe a dynamic nature of anhedonia and depression, but a more trait-like anhedonic state in schizophrenia.
I can definitely, I can definitely believe that, in a kind of a negative symptomy kind of way that is kind of deeply entrenched, and one sees that more. I would be, perfectly prepared to accept that. I mean, depression is supposed to be more episodic, though we do see lots of dysthymia as well in many people, which is often underappreciated. But I agree, depression is classically thought of, at least, as an episodic illness. So the anhedonia will also be episodic. Having said that, we find that the stability of anhedonia in the depressed population is fairly high. It's about, SHAPS is a stability of about 0.6. So, 0.65 around there. So it's, it's not like it comes and goes completely in many people. So just putting it out there. But it resonates with me what the doctor said.
Yeah, maybe I'll add a similar kind of question. In the people that you mentioned, the importance of long-term expectations and outlooks. I believe that psychology sort of divides people into a sort of a trait of negative cognitive bias versus less negative or positive cognitive bias. Does that sort of factor into that long-term outlook that you described?
It's an interesting one. I haven't looked into this, but it's an interesting framework, actually. So it's something to note. I don't know of work that has looked into long-term cognitive biases. We might have data to look into this that could help us kind of understand this better. It's an interesting notion. I don't know is the answer. I don't know.
And then there's another question here from Greg Barber, similar. What about the developmental influence on that long-term outlook, right? People that have negative experiences early in life and programmed in a way that leads them to have a less positive long-term outlook.
Yeah, and I like the notion. I just see that in the chat of kind of the notion of overly strong priors, and that they're less susceptible to updating. So this it would be part of my answer. But I should first say that I don't have enough people yet that I can break them down into those with into groups according to their early experiences that I'm empowered enough to be answering questions like this. But it's something that we do want to look into, and it's very possible that early life experiences do mean that you have stronger priors. For example, that would be one reason why you don't update your expectations of the world. It could be that there are strong priors. It could be that there is that the mechanism is different, and I'm talking very kind of metaphorically now. But it's an attempt at maintaining expectations low, not necessarily because of the strong priors, but because there's a kind of an ongoing adjustment, as opposed to something that kind of weighs on it from the very beginning. So it's kind of it's more like a feedback loop that is kind of trying to pull things at a certain level. So that's very possible. And it could be that violation of the piece of, there are some people who are particularly susceptible to violations of expectations, upwards or downwards, actually. So and early lifetime experiences could be a reason for that. In fact, people looking after depressed patients will often say that it's very frustrating that you can't, that people with depression often maybe even hard to kind of shift downwards as well as upwards. It's not just, it's kind of there's a certain resistance all along. There's a flatness of the affect.
This is Jill. I have a question all related to this prize effect and anhedonia. I can't help but notice, Dr. Stringaris, that you used people that are anhedonic, like their drugs, like their alcohol, will play computer games forever. We all know about internet addiction or gaming addiction. So all of your examples were actually disorders really of addiction. And I wonder if that says something about the connection or the influence of the brain pathways that manage or control addiction versus what is going on. Does it override what is driving the anhedonia? Just an observation.
No, it's a very astute observation, and there's the work that people like Dr. Nora Volkoff have done in addiction, and that looks into the straighter response and anhedonia, and she describes people with drug addictions as having anhedonia, as if there's a way to think of anhedonia that's more complex than just, I stopped liking rewards altogether, but rather it's being something, I need more of this, and I need a very strong stimulation in order to maintain a certain hedonia, and therefore I have to go back and have this very strong stimulation that is afforded to me by some strongly dopaminergic drug that does something to my striatal reward system. So she's written about this a fair amount. So I think this is very important. It's just also, the rates of alcohol addiction, drug addiction, all sorts of things in depression is higher, not lower. So, if depression were a pathology of hedonia, just stop liking anything altogether, then we should have solved the problem of addictions in our patients. Well, it's exactly the opposite, isn't it? So, yeah.
If I may, this is Dr. Dodi, Dr. Argyris. Thank you for very stimulating and thought-provoking talk. My question is more clinical. We use this, for example, Samuel Saracen group promote post-psychotic depression. On the top of it, affective disorder, where the sequence of events. And in geriatric, we talk about apathy, old people with dementia. Are we talking about the same thing? Are we talking different things? And I know it is mind-boggling. Are you saying these are all qualitatively or quantitatively different?
Yeah, well, this is a very good question. I've been wondering about this since I was training. I don't know is the answer, because I was thinking, okay, where does schizoaffective disorder start, and where does it end? I mean, in some cases it's pretty clear, in some cases it's not. So I don't know. There could be commonalities. You mentioned apathy, and apathy is a very interesting construct, which seems to be slightly distinct to anhedonia, at least according to some people. We don't measure it that much. I know that others who do find that the correlation is not very, so that the two are distinguishable. In any case, I think John Roycer, who studies this in London a lot, and Masood Hussain in Oxford find that they can kind of distinguish the two. So apathy is an interesting one, of course, because yes, you do find it in old age patients. You find it in people with Parkinson's disease, and I think you also find it in people with depression. Except, as Ken Kendler would say, at some point, some committee decided that there's only 9 criteria for depression, and and apathy wasn't one of them, so it isn't in there at the moment. But traditionally, it was, right. I mean, in other conceptions of depression, it was, and there were other symptoms as well that were in there. So the honest answer is I haven't studied it. I don't know. And there are people in the audience who I'm sure know better about the nosological question of schizoaffective disorders, but I share your puzzlement about it, to be honest, Dr. Dodi. And thank you very much for the question.
This is Dr. David Gorelick. Want to switch gears a little. Do you see any value in the mood versus affect distinction? Because in my classical clinical psychiatry training, which I admit was 50 years ago, we distinguish between mood, more like climate, versus affect, more like weather. And your time frame of seconds to minutes, I would have thought is more as affect than mood.
Yeah, your training is just as up to date, I think, as mine certainly, and I don't think much has changed. And this is something that bothers me, that you know, it hasn't. These conceptions haven't changed in recent years. So we could, you know, people have said this before. There's people who say, oh, maybe it's more of an emotion what you're measuring rather than a mood. You and others have said, oh, maybe it's affect. I tried to, and I agree this is not kind of something that everyone would agree with, but we try to reserve the term affect for the moment. This is just a decision for kind of the more outwardly observable features, right? And we try to talk about emotions for something very short. How short is short? You know, something that could happen in an instant. And mood for anything that is in the order of kind of minutes and above. You know, the term could indeed change. I think the way to test for these things is to just see what happens on longer time scales. So I think the best way to answer your question is for me to come back to you next time and say, well, is my model invariant to time? Is it a model that captures also what happens when we talk about hours or when we talk about weeks? And then you know, I'll have a firmer ground for answering your question, Dr. Korolik, I think.
Then there's another question here from Dr. Culbreth in the chat box, talking about mood and its relationship to learning, and I would add also to memory. Right? We know that in depression there's not merely a disturbances of mood, but there are a lot of cognitive defects as well. And I can remember early on a psychiatrist telling me that was the thing that often sent patients to his office first before mood. So can you comment a little bit on how you think about the relationship between those processes?
Yeah, so I'm reading the question in the chapter. Okay, so this is what we're doing right now, right? So what we're trying to understand is how does context play a role. So if you're in a first of all, there is evidence from what I've shown you that there's some sort of memory effect, right? Because some able to build those expectations. Somehow you keep track of what's going on. You have this long-term average term, you know, which is basically your expectation term. You discount it in some sort of way, and that's how you arrive at it. So there is some sort of memory effect. Okay. So that's the first clear thing. Now, when we think about kind of actual kind of other, you know, learning, I don't know whether it would be a classical kind of reinforcement learning model or not, but what we're trying to see now is whether the parameters of the model will change depending on the environment you're in. So whether individuals realize what environment they're in, and whether they learn from it and learn to respond to it and rate their mood differently. So this is ongoing work. It's not a resolved question. The reinforcement learning is clearer when it comes to decision making, obviously, right? This is the typical kind of Sartre and Barto kind of models, where there's an agent and they learn. You can apply reinforcement learning to see how, you know, whether they will go from A to B or not. So in terms of decision making, that is clear. In terms of how we learn that is translated into mood, I think that's less clear. And that's kind of what we're trying to do right now, borrowing models from memory research, the context sensitivity models. So I can't answer the question directly because I don't yet have the necessary data from it. All I can say as a preliminary kind of response is that the way we're trying to model this at the moment is some sort of change analysis in a Bayesian framework, and we do seem to find kind of contextual sensitivity of mood, which shouldn't be surprising, but it means so that the actual parameters of the model change in different environments. So that's, I guess, what I can say. The next kind of iteration of the model will include a context term as well.
So I have a question, Dr. Stringaris. How minimal of stimulation is really needed to be considered rest? And I imagine that's something that probably varies by person. But do you think it's more the degree of sensory stimulation, what's happening in the world, or more the degree of internal processing? Like, could I be thinking really hard about something even though there's just a fixation point in front of me?
Yeah, I must tell you that we did try our very best to get rid of the kind of this effect, this resting state dysphoria, we call it passage of time dysphoria. So we had them play this gamble game, right? And you would have thought that it would be stimulating and enough for this linear parameter to become non-significant, for the mood not to drop, and it didn't. So we need to throw more things at it. I think that my feeling is that, and this is again the subject of research of our research now is, well, it's about future expectations. What's coming? What do you think is coming up next? Now that was the same across individuals. We didn't vary that. We hadn't told. It was the same. So there must be some inter-individual variability in this, obviously, and how people construe the future. And given the fact that the reliability at the individual level of the passage of time dysphoria effect is not that high, my guess is that this is a combination of state and trait. So I don't have the minimal stimulation necessary, but all I can say is that if you're doing a resting state in the scanner, you should be worried about those results. That's the most I can say. At the moment. The next kind of interesting questions that we need to answer is, okay, what if you tell the person that there's $10 expecting them afterwards, as opposed to kind of $2, as opposed to, that sort of manipulation would be very interesting, I think.
So there's a question here regarding that terrifying slide you showed of all the unique combinations of depressive symptoms that you can come up with. And so the question is, how does that predict response to antidepressant drugs, maybe of a particular class, or long-term chances of remission?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have those data yet, and I don't know whether our experimental results predict the ones that have been showing in the second half of the talk. Predict treatment response. I don't think they will at the moment. It's my honest answer. I really don't think so. If that's the question, yeah. Or did I get the question wrong? I'm sorry.
There's some evidence, and I'm blanking on the woman's name in England, who shows that if you give SSRIs, you can get an immediate change in.
Kath Harmer.
Yes. Yeah,
it's Kath Harmer, Professor Catherine Harmer. Yes. Yeah, that's brilliant work, and we collaborate. Actually, we have done some work together recently with Professor Harmer. Yes, but this is this work that was initially with reboxetine, right? In adults, what it showed was that before any symptoms change, there's a change in the perception of faces, right? Of emotional faces. I think particularly the perception of angry faces, if I recall correctly, right? And that this happens pretty early on, and that is kind of an early predictor of response. I think that is true. I don't think it's a predictor, of course, that is clinically useful at the moment, and I think it's a very important piece of work to inform theory and our understanding of the interactions of cognition and depression and emotion. But it's not at a level yet where it could be utilized clinically, i.e. at the individual level.
Yeah, I don't remember from that work whether it's sort of uniform or whether there are some responders and some non-responders. I can't remember.
Yeah, I think my memory from this is that there are some people who do and some people who don't. But I am not sure. This is something to go back to Catherine, ask her about this is to see where this work is in terms of parsing people, using it as a clinical predictor. Using some of the up-to-date frameworks of predictive machine learning. I don't know is the answer. I don't know. Yeah.
Then there's a question here from Jim Waltz again about the concept of mood as momentum from Eldar and Rutledge.
So it sounds like it sounds like those are some of the ideas that you're incorporating in the data and ideas that you presented. Is that true?
Yeah. So the work. So this is work that we've actually done together with Rob Rutledge. So both the paper that is under review at eLife and the resting state data, we did actually using his great brain experiment data, the great brain experiment data that he's used from UCL. There are a couple of important points of diversion. So one is the concept of the prediction error. So if you recall in Dr. Rutledge's model, in his PNAS paper, the reward prediction error, which is for everybody to kind of so we're all on the same page. But the prediction error is defined as the difference between what you expect and what you get, right? Or what you get minus what you expected. So outcome minus expectation. So in Rob's work, the prediction errors were trial imminent. So it was what you expected for that particular trial and what you got versus what you expected for that particular trial. In our models, which fit better than those original models with this RPE formulation, we parameterize the RPE, and the important RPE for us is the difference is what arises from the long-term average. So there's a long-term average expectation, and that's what matters. It's not the trial imminent expectation, but it's the long-term average expectation. The implication for that is that it can be shown mathematically that the models are different in terms of the primacy and the recency effect. And in fact, places great emphasis on the primacy effects, the early events, whereas his model is more of a recency model, as are most models that have been proposed for mood. We show in that paper that we're revising that in all cases, I'm just as we're still kind of revising, there's a bit of reservation in some of the last analysis that we do, so take that with a pinch of salt. But I think it's fair to say that in pretty much all of the things that we have looked so far, our kind of primacy model is superior to the standard recency model. So that's kind of one important point of departure. The other one is that the model we're proposing incorporates now the passage of time dysphoria, so the linear effect of mood, the linear effect of time on mood. So those are kind of two important differences in how mood is conceptualized. And I think particularly the passage of time dysphoria will have pretty significant implications, I think, for the conception of mood as we look at the concept of opportunity cost, so kind of the expectation from the future next. I hope that answers the question.
So in that context of reward expectation versus reward delivery, right? I mean, one of the favorite tricks of us preclinical folks is sort of changing the rules mid-game and either disappointing the subject or I suppose you could extra reward the subject already. You can make the all of a sudden you expect to get your gambling reward and oh sorry the bank machine's empty or something like that. I mean, can you play with those kinds of things and change the subject's mood in your experimental paradigm?
Yeah, I mean what you're referring to, I guess, is a typical kind of reversal learning type of experimental setup, right?
I wasn't thinking of it that way, but you're right. There's certainly a learning component to it and a memory.
Yes, I'm sorry. I mean that's what comes to mind for me. Yeah, that you kind of switch it midway. Yes. Now, if I've turned off my screen, but I can describe to you. So you saw that we have this curve where mood goes up, goes down, goes back up again. So in the experiments we do right now to understand the role of context and of memory, we do this a lot more, as it were. So we will be doing this at much higher frequencies, these changes, so that we can see how, so that our model has more to learn from, as it were, about those changes, and we can model context. So we will be doing that. And we have built this thing we call mood machine interface, this closed loop machine, which does precisely what you're describing. So we build up people's expectations, and then we kind of violate them, right? And so we violate those trial imminent RPEs to kind of modulate mood. So
and those are not persistent. Those are you can. That's the sort of the curve you showed where people come back to the same level they were beforehand.
Yeah, and to be honest, as I think I said this, the passage of time dysphoria effect we only discovered because I said, okay, well, let's see how long this lasts for, right? The change that we do, and then we saw that people stabilized, and then people kind of then the mood declined. So yes, they return back. So we're trying to do something that is more sustainable, or is sustained in terms of mood. Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I've lost the chat window here. Have we exhausted the questions for Dr. Stringaris?
I think we got them all, Scott.
Again, really a very thought-provoking presentation. Something that we think we understand and think of as a pretty simple concept. If you look closely enough at it, you find all the nuance and things that we take for granted and don't build into our expectations.
Can I say something, Dr. Thompson? Just one last thing. One of the thoughts I've had recently, which I wanted to put to the group, but we don't need to discuss it. But it's one of the things that matters to me. We typically think of emotions as something. We're trained to think of emotions as something that someone has as a result of what is happening in the environment, and we rarely think of the fact that whenever we have an emotion, well, not whenever we have, but very frequently when we have an emotion and display it, we have an effect on our environment. So that effect that we have through a mood in our environment, like if you saw me suddenly looking at you, in a very friendly way, it'd be very different for you compared to if I looked at you in a very threatening way, right? So the emotions we have also have implications for what happens in the environment, and the feedback that we get from the environment provides a learning stimulus for us. We sustain or don't such emotions. This is something that is completely underappreciated in the world of mood modeling. So the effects of the mood onto the environment, and then the feedback one gets. I'm saying this because I think it is very important in clinical terms, and clinicians kind of think about it a lot, but it's not something that is formalized. I mean, the most classical example is kind of social learning and children who are angry, right? And the parenting intervention people will tell you, when your child is angry, don't mirror the anger. That sort of thing, which is pretty basic. And it's something that we haven't yet thought about in terms of our models of mood. And this is something that this is kind of as part of this kind of contextual work that we're doing. We're trying to incorporate those things too. So effects of the mood that one displays onto the environment, and the feedback that results from it. Because a lot, I think, of what sustains mood states is, of course, the response to the environment, which from a clinical point of view sounds trivial. From a modeling point of view, it's a bit of kind of uncharted territory.
Sorry, but that stimulates a question. This is David Gorelick. Could that be one of the evolutionary processes that triggered the maintenance of mood? I mean, you mentioned earlier it serves an internal function of integrating response to environmental events, but it may have also evolved to help humans interact with each other in a more efficient way.
There's no doubt about it. And Randolph Ness, in his book, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, talks about some of these things. He doesn't talk about the modeling part, but he talks about the fact that, well, why has emotion and why have negative emotions survived, right? I mean, to give you one example, if I'm depressed, if I look sad, you may come and console me, or you'll just tell me, oh, just give the man a rest, just let him off the hook for today, right? That sort of thing. So they certainly serve. I mean, those, Darwin would have said that too. What are those displays of emotion that we have in the face? Why are they there? I think it's pretty clear that they must be doing exactly what you say.
Yeah, I didn't mean to prolong the.
Oh no, sorry, and sorry, Dr. Thompson. I didn't mean to have the conversation either, but it's just, I think, an important point.
But I guess that's also sort of a setting of a trait in some way too, right? I mean, you are programmed your priors, I guess, as it came up before, right? I mean, you have the expectation that if you smile at people, they're going to smile back at you, and or not, perhaps.
That's right. And a constant, and I think that in some ways the emotions we tend to show are kind of constitutive of our identity. Oh, he's such a lovely, nice, happy person, isn't he? This is not just some sort of kind of general sociological observation. I think this is how people understand and construct their own self, and the way we construct our own self has implications of when it is violated by our environment, or something happens and violates it. And I think that therefore it's very relevant to depression. But the problem with these things is that they happen in the longer run, and they're very hard to model in the laboratory. So what we have to do is to kind of break them down and study them. I don't think it's that easy, but I think you do build up expectations about who you are based on the emotions you display, and because your environment has those expectations from you. You see that anyone who has children will have seen that, right? Oh, this is a very, very difficult child, so you expect them to do something, right? And oh, this is a lovely child. So the whole environment acts differently to it, and there's different expectations that are being built up, and a different kind of learning that the individual that's bearing the emotion had. I don't know whether anyone is interested in sociology, but I strongly recommend, this is a bit off field, I strongly recommend Ari Hochschild's book on emotional labor. You may have heard about emotional labor. It's extremely interesting. Nothing to do with modeling, which is understanding sociology, I think, at Berkeley, talking about phenomena like this from her perspective. So I kind of, yeah.
Thank you.
Anyway.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for spending so much time letting us toss ideas at you and
thank you.
Feedback, and the discussion has been invaluable. Appreciate it very much. It's also great news that you're only 35 miles down I-95, and I hope we have lots more opportunities to increase the interaction between the Baltimore end of that stretch of the highway and the.
I hope so too. It's been very, very educative for me. So thank you all very, very much for your comments and questions. I appreciate this.
Great pleasure, and thank you very much, Jill, for encouraging the PIN representation here today. I saw a lot of PIN names on the participant list, and I think that's really fantastic and something to be strived for.
Agreed. It's great. We'll do a lot more of it, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for being with us today.
Dr. Stringaris, you broke the record on attendance.
Oh, gosh, I embarrassed myself in front of many people there. That's
oh good. No, that's good. 135. You get the prize. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Being an hour of discussion afterwards.
Okay.